There are some historical crimes that are horrifying, not only because of what was done, but because of how calm, methodical, and professional they were carried out. They were not committed by mobs in moments of rage. They were committed by trained men in white coats inside offices, clinics, laboratories, universities, and government agencies. That is what makes the Tuskegee civilians study and the Guatemala civilians experiments so disturbing to me. There were no accidents. They were not one-day scandals. They were, now they were organized systems of deception carried out over years by people who knew exactly what they were doing, whereas they at very least knew enough to understand that what they were doing could not be defended morally. In Tuskegee, Black Americans with their civilians were deliberately left untreated, so their government could, observe the natural course of their disease. In Guatemala, vulnerable people were intentionally infected so their researchers could study sexually transmitted disease transmission and prophylaxis. There were two different methods, but to me, they reveal the same mentality. Some lives were treated as expendable raw material for science. To understand Tuskegee properly, I think we need to start with the people behind it, because the deeper truth is that abuses like this does not happen by accident. Some people, designed it. Some people authorized it. Some people carried it out. Some people maintained it, and some people kept quiet while they, continued. The Tuskegee study began in 1932 under the U.S. Public Health Service. It enrolled 600 poor American people, especially black people, in Macon County, Alabama, including 399 men with Latin syphilis and 201 controls. They were promised free medical care and burial assistance, but they were not told the true nature of their study and were misled into believing they were receiving treatment for bad blood. The study was originally framed as a short-term project, but stretched to 40 years. Even after the penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis by the mid-1940s, treatment was withheld. One of the earliest key figures was the Daniel Farrell Knarr, the head of the venereal disease section of the Public Health Service, and the man credited with the founding, the Tuskegee study. What matters to me is not just what he was involved, but what his thinking represented. The record shows that racial assumptions were built into the very framing of their project. Researchers believe that syphilis affected black patients differently, and some of the language used by officials reflected, ugly assumptions about intelligence, poverty, sexuality, and supposed, indifference to treatment. That matters because it tells us this was never simply a neuroscientific inquiry. It was shaped from the beginning by racist ideas about whose suffering could be observed at a distance. In my view, once the study is built on the assumption that vulnerable racial group can be used in ways others will not be used, the actual failure, is already present before the first needle touches skin. Then can Raymond A. Wagner, one of the most important operational figures in Tuskegee. If Knarr helped create this study, Wagner helped sustain it. This is where the story starts looking like vouch institutional wrongdoing and starts looking like a series of deliberate choices. During World War II, when hundreds of the infected subjects were identified through military draft procedures and were supposed to receive treatment before service, public health service researchers intervened and to keep them from being treated. The records connected to the study describe Wagner defending the importance of continuing their research and referring to it as a valuable scientific opportunity. That detail is devastating to me because it shows the study was not simply drifting forward on inertia. Opportunities to cure the man existed. Those opportunities were actively blocked. Once you do that, you are no longer observing history. You are manufacturing suffering for data. Another central figure was the nurse Eunice Rivers. She was the main point of contact between the study and the local black community. She kept relationships with participants over decades and helped maintain trust. That part of the story is important because it shows how abuse does not always come, wearing the face of obvious hostility. Sometimes it comes from familiarity, reassurance, and continuity. That may, come back because of human relationship had been built. That relationship makes the deception more effective. I want to be careful here because history around individual blame can be complicated, especially for people working inside unequal structures. But what cannot be denied is that the study needed, trusted bridge to their community, and Rivers was that bridge. Without trust, the study would have been harder to sustain. To me, that is one of the most chilling aspects of the Tuskegee. Not only was the medicine used as a tool of harm, but trust itself was turned into an instrument of control. The methods used in Tuskegee were also more manipulative than people sometimes realized. The men were not simply left alone. They were, deceived repeatedly. They were never fully informed of their diagnoses. Placebos, ineffective treatments, and even diagnostic procedures were disguised as care. Painful lumbar punctures were presented as a special treatment, and participants were lured in with the misleading letter promising special free treatment. Scientists also keep them from accessing treatment programs that existed elsewhere in the area. That means the men were not abandoned in some passive sense. They were drawn into a false medical relationship and kept inside it. My own view is that this distinction matters. If someone does nothing, that is neglect. If someone lies to you, performs procedures on you, blocks your access to real treatment, and monitors your decline, that is something much darker. And the consequences were not abstract. By the end of the study, only 74 of the arranged subjects were still alive. Of the 399 men with syphilis, 28 were reported to have died directly of the disease, and around 100 from the, related complications. 40 wives were infected, and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. The study lasted until it was exposed in 1972. To me, these numbers matter not just as statistics, but because they show the experiment did not remain contained inside the clinic. It entered marriage, pregnancies, and family life. It turned human beings into vectors in a system that knew more than just victims did. That is why I do not see Tuskegee as merely a failed medical study. I see it as a moral collapse that extended from the state into the private lives of ordinary people. Another layer that gives Tuskegee more depth is the fact that there were dissenters and they were ignored. In 1964, Dr. Alvin Schwartz wrote to the study authors, condemning what he saw was a bluntly, unethical conduct, and this warning was ignored. In 1966, Peter Buxton, a public health service venereal disease investigator with the ethical objections intention, the CDC then overseeing the study reaffirmed that it should continue until all subjects had died and been outside. Buxton eventually went to the press, and John Helker of the Associated Press broke the story in 1972. I think this is one of the strongest proofs that Tuskegee cannot be excused as a product of the ignorance. People objected warnings were available. The system have heard those warnings and chose itself over the victims. That is not confusion. That is institutional will. If Tuskegee was a study in withholding treatment, Guatemala was a study in active infection, and then difference is essential. The Guatemala experiments were conducted from 1946 to 1948 under U.S. leadership. The purpose was to study sexually transmitted disease prevention and treatment, especially whether penicillin could work as a prophylaxis after exposure. Around 696 people were intentionally infected with syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid, according to one widely cited figure, while broader research tied to the program involved far more people, with some tallies reaching to the thousands. The subjects included prisoners, soldiers, physicians, psychiatric patients, sex workers, children, school children, and others from poor and vulnerable populations, many of them, indigenous Guatemalans and impoverished Guatemalans. In my view, this is the point where any claim that science was simply trying to help humanity begins to sound morally empty, because the humanity being helped and the humanity being used more, clearly not treated as equal. The central name here is John Charles Connor. He was a U.S. Public Health Service physician who led the Guatemala experiments, and then he later also participated in the late stages of Tuskegee. That fact alone should stop people in their tracks. We are not looking at these two random isolation scandals with no overlap. We are looking at the continuity in personnel and mentality. Charles had already been involved in the Terry O prison experiments, where researchers were trying to infect prisoners with gonorrhea under more controlled conditions. When that effort failed to produce the infection reliably enough, the war moved to Guatemala. To me, this reveals something brutally clear. The question was never whether, infecting people was acceptable. The question was where it should work be done more easily, with fewer legal restraints, less concern about consent, and less public scrutiny. John F. Mahoney was another figure who needs to be named, because history never often remembers a man in the van holding syringe and forgets the man above him approving, founding, and supervising the war. Mahoney was the director of the venereal disease research laboratory, a key supervisor of the Guatemala project, and the primary recipient of the Connor reports. He was also celebrated for his work helping establish penicillin as a cure for syphilis. That is one of the most bitter ironies in this entire story. A man associated with the cure was also tied to a system that infected vulnerable people and oversaw experiments in which consent was absent or compromised. To me, that contradiction exposes the recurring danger in science. Professional prestige can coexist with moral blindness. A successful medical career does not guarantee a clean conscience. Then there is Thomas Perrin, the U.S. Surgeon General. The full extent of his knowledge may not be completely recoverable, but the documentary record includes a remark attributed to him in a 1947 letter to Connor. You know, we couldn't do such an experiment in this country. That sentence to me is one of the most revealing in the entire case. Even if someone wanted to defend him by saying his precious role in remains unclear, the sentence itself speaks values. It suggests awareness that the experiment crossed a line, not that it was immediately uncertain, not that it was merely controversial, that it was a sort of, thing that could not be done at home. In my view, once an official understands that an act is too unethical or too dangerous, particularly to perform on people in his own country, but it becomes a symbol abroad. That is not just bad science, that is colonial morality. Van Funnels also deserves attention because he shows how local collaboration can become part of the transitional abuse. He was the head of the Guatemalan venereal disease control department, and moved to Guatemala was suggested by him. He later worked with Mahoney and others as research continued, and after the infection phase ended, Guatemalan collaborators continued collecting data, including blood samples and number punctures from vulnerable groups. I think this part is important because people often want a neat story where one side is purely evil and the other side is purely victimized. Real history is often uglier. Systems of abuse frequently recruit local administrators, professionals, and intermediaries. That is not reduce U.S. responsibility, but it shows that institutions can build networks of complicity when power, funding, prestige, and hierarchy align. The methods of Guatemala were also more brutal than many people realized. In 1947, Gardner began Gardnerville experiments on Guatemalan soldiers. Around 600 soldiers were infected over about a year and a half. Infected sex workers were used to expose soldiers. Gardnerville material from infected soldiers was injected into other soldiers. Cancroid experiments were also conducted by searching, soldiers' arms and infecting their wounds, and the so-called concern that existed in some cases came not from the subjects themselves, but from officials or doctors above them. That is not meaningful concern. That is permission granted by authority over someone else's body. Mana that should never be forgotten is Burton, a psychiatric patient whose case has become one of the clearest human illustrations of what this system did. According to the records cited in later reporting and archival investigation, Berta was injected with syphilis in 1948. Months later, as her condition deteriorated, Connor reported that she appeared close to death. Yet, instead of stopping, he put Gardnerville pus from another subject into her eyes and some parts of her body. And several days later, she died. I think people need to sit with their case and resist the temptation to hide behind abstract words like study, protocol, or research objective, whatever scientific language may have surrounded it. A dying vulnerable omen was used again and again as an experimental surface, forming that is merely an actual medicine. It is a form of dehumanization so severe that calling it a scandal almost fails to weigh. Another figure worth noting is Genevieve Stout, a bacterial analogist with the Pan American Sanitary Bureau. After Connor left Guatemala in 1948, she managed the laboratory there and continued serological research with local collaborators. This matters because it reminds us that the program was not one dramatic aberration that ended the moment one man walked away. It had institutional, afterlife. Data collection continued, blood samples continued, number punctures, continued. School children and orphans, psychiatric patients, and inmates remain inside a research orbit that outlasted the arranged infection phase. To me, this reveals one of the ugliest habits of abusive systems. Once the human beings have been turned into data producing objects, the machine trains to keep harvesting. The exposure history of Guatemala is also deeply important. The experiments were uncovered decades later by historian Susan while she was researching Tuskegee in John Connor's archived papers. In 2010, the U.S. President, Secretary of State, and Secretary of Health and Human Services formally apologized to Guatemala. A U.S. Biotech Ethics Commission later received more than 125,000 arranged papers of documentaries and hundreds of secondary sources in detailed fact investigation. That tells me two things. First, the story was real, extensive, and documentable. Second, it remained hidden for a astonishing long time, and that delay matters morally. A scandal that is hidden for 60 years is not just a wrong of action; it is also a wrong of silence, storage, forgetting, and delayed accountability. When I compare these two scandals side by side, I do not think the deepest lesson is simply that science can be dangerous. That is too shallow. The deeper lesson, in my opinion, is that institutions can commit abuse in two different modes. The first mode is abandonment, disguised as care. That is Tuskegee. The second mode is violence disguised as research. That is Guatemala. In one case, men were watched as disease consumed them while treatment was withheld. In the other, people were deliberately injected because their bodies were seen as useful testing grounds. But both require the same ingredients: hierarchy, racial and social distance, control over their vulnerable populations, professional ambition, and belief that the knowledge matter more than the rights of their subjects. I also think it is a mistake to reduce these events to the products of their time, as if that phase settles the issue. Yes, these studies emerged in a different ethical era, but even then, objections existed, dissenters existed, researchers knew enough to worry about consent, publicity, and legal consequences. The decision to ship the war to Guatemala partly because of fear, ethical, and legal constraints is especially telling. You do not relocate a project to escape a concern unless you already understand there is something morally wrong with what you are doing. So my conclusion is very simple. There were not just blind spots of history, there were choices. What angers me most is the code mismatch between the language of the researchers and the reality of the victims. On paper, there were subjects, prof- prophylaxis, observations and study sections. In reality, there were poor black sharecroppers in Alabama, soldiers, prisoners, psychiatric patients, children, wives infected at home, children born with congenital disease, and people like Berta whose conditions turned into just a tragedy. That's very sad. I don't feel like to see anything like this because it's too heartbroken. But if you feel this is very heartbreaking, you can just tell me how you feel about this story. Okay, I hope to see you in next video.